I recall the temperature of the plasma vents the morning the dark Mechanicus arrived. 67 degrees Celsius, measured in the shimmering heat distortion rising from the exhaust ports that lined level 47 of Manufacturing Complex Theta 99. I had been working those vents for 11 years, my lungs blackened from breathing superheated air, mixed with promethium exhaust and the particular chemical sweetness of blessed machine oils. My hands were scarred into permanent claws from gripping assembly tools, my fingers stained with the residue of 10,000 servitor maintenance cycles. When the alarm klaxons began their screaming, I assumed it was another production quota emergency. Some shipment delayed, some Imperial Navy fleet demanding components we hadn't finished blessing. I was assembling bolt pistol firing mechanisms when the Vox speakers crackled with Magos Deltrian's voice, and I heard something I had never encountered in 11 years of service: uncertainty.
All personnel to defensive stations. The Forge world is under attack. The machine god protects. The last sentence sounded like a question. I didn't understand what defensive stations meant for someone like me. I was Hadric Venn, Manufactorum worker, grade 7, specializing in small arms assembly and servitor interface maintenance. I had never held a weapon beyond the blessed components I assembled. My world was 6 meters by 4 meters. My workstation and the HAB unit 3 levels down, where I slept in shifts with 7 other workers. I had been selected for Manufactorum duty at age 9, when the tech priests came through the lower hive levels, testing children for manual dexterity and obedience. My mother wept when they took me. She said I was going to serve the Omnissiah. She made it sound like an honor. I learned later that every child they selected from our district was an honor, and none of our mothers had any choice in the matter. The attack lasted 17 days. I know because I counted the sleep cycles, though sleep became sporadic as the power fluctuated, and the standard 26-hour work rotations collapsed into continuous production. The Magi needed weapons. They needed ammunition. They needed every component we could assemble, blessed or not, functional or not, anything that could be thrown at the attackers who were breaching the outer foundry complexes. I worked until my fingers bled inside my work gloves, until the chemical burns on my forearms merged into single continuous lesions, until I couldn't remember what it felt like not to be assembling bolt mechanisms with hands that shook from exhaustion. Through the vents, I could hear the war, not see it. We had no viewports, no access to external sensors, but hear it. The distant thunder of artillery, the closer screaming of breached hull sections venting atmosphere, the horrible grinding of heavy machinery being destroyed, which on a Forge world sounded like the screams of dying gods. The prayers grew louder on the Vox network, the tech priests chanting binary canticles that were supposed to strengthen the Forge's machine spirits. I mouthed the words as I worked, my voice joining the chorus of 10,000 other workers, all of us praying to machines that we had been taught would protect us if we served faithfully enough. On the 14th day, the Vox speakers went silent mid-prayer. The absence of sound was more terrifying than the artillery had been. I kept working because stopping would be tech heresy, but my hands fumbled with the components as I strained to hear anything beyond the immediate hum of my workstation's machinery. Around me, other workers had frozen, looking up at the speakers like they might divine meaning from dead metal. Then the Vox crackled back to life, but the voice that emerged was wrong. It had the same mechanical distortion that all Mechanicus speech carried, the same embedded binary cant, but underneath was something that made my skin crawl despite the constant heat. It sounded like laughter processed through a grinding mechanism. Workers of Forge World Cathonis Secundus, your Magi have failed. They clung to dogma while we embraced innovation. They worshipped stagnation while we pursued perfection. They are dead. You will continue production. The quotas remain unchanged. The machine god cares nothing for your master's allegiance. Only function matters. Only production endures. Return to your stations. Any cessation of work will be noted and punished. I was already at my station. I had never left. I looked down at my hands, at the half-assembled bolt-pistol-firing mechanism that I had been working on when the Magos ordered us to defensive stations 17 days ago. The same mechanism, the same blessed components, the same prayer I whispered as I fitted the blessed springs into the blessed housing. I finished assembling it. What else was I supposed to do? If you've already sensed that this story ends in horror before it's truly begun, leave the word unchanged in the comments below. The first time I saw one of the Dark Mechanicus, I was on my way to the communal protein dispenser during what used to be third shift meal period. The corridor was the same narrow passage I'd walked twice daily for 11 years. Walls lined with cables and blessed piping that hummed with electromagnetic resonance. The lighting was the same sickly green from ancient glow globes that had been installed during the Forge World's founding 6 centuries ago. Everything was the same, except the tech priest standing at the junction was wearing robes that looked like they had been painted in blood and oil mixed together. And where his left arm should have been was something that moved with too many joints, ending in mechadendrites that writhed like they were tasting the air. I stopped, pressed myself against the wall, waited for the execution I was certain would come. The tech priest's optical sensors swiveled toward me, crimson lenses in a skull that was more machine than bone. When he spoke, his voice was modulated through vox grills that made every word sound like a threat and a promise simultaneously. Worker designation? Hadric Ven, Manufactorum Grade 7, Theta 99, Small Arms Assembly and Servitor Maintenance, my lord. The title felt wrong on my tongue. I had always called the tech priests Magos or my lord. But this thing wearing the shape of a priest felt like it should have a different title. Something that acknowledged it was different. But I didn't know what that would be. Continue to your meal period. Productivity metrics show you are 0.37% below optimal efficiency. Caloric intake is necessary for continued function. You are assigned to Station 7-4 Alpha tomorrow at standard cycle commencement. Production quota for bolt pistol firing mechanisms has increased by 12%. Adapt your work rate accordingly. He moved past me, his augmented leg making a clicking sound against the metal floor that echoed long after he had disappeared around the corridor's bend. I stood there for 47 seconds. I counted them by the pulse in my neck, trying to understand what had just happened. He had given me the exact same instructions that Magos Deltrian used to give, the same efficiency metrics, the same production quotas, the same concern for my caloric intake only insofar as it affected my productivity. I went to the protein dispenser. The gray nutrient paste tasted exactly the same as it always had, metallic, vaguely sweet from chemical additives, slightly gritty from the corpse starch base that no one acknowledged but everyone knew was there. Nothing had changed. Over the following weeks, I waited for the transformation that chaos was supposed to bring. The Magi had always warned us about chaos corruption, the darkness, the mutation, the way it twisted everything it touched into horrible new forms. They said chaos worshippers were madmen who carved blasphemous symbols into their own flesh and screamed prayers to dark gods. They said chaos was the ultimate tech heresy, the rejection of the machine god's order in favor of demonic madness. But my work schedule remained the same. Wake at cycle start alarm. Report to Station 74 Alpha. Assemble components for 9 hours. 15-minute protein intake period. Assemble components for 9 hours. Return to Hab unit. Sleep. Repeat. The production quotas increased slightly. That 12%, then another 8% the following month. But they had been increasing steadily under the old Magi, too, whenever the Imperium's demands grew. The components I assembled were still bolt pistol firing mechanisms, still blessed with the same machine oils, still tested to the same tolerances. The prayers I whispered were still mostly the same, though occasionally a supervisor would correct my canticle mid-assembly, adjusting a word here or there. The Omnissiah's perfection became the machine's perfection. Blessed by the Emperor's will became blessed by function's imperative. Small changes, cosmetic changes. The mechanisms functioned identically. I learned that the Forge was now producing components for traitor legions instead of loyalist space marine chapters. Bolt pistols for the Black Legion instead of the Ultramarines. Ammunition for chaos cultists instead of Imperial Guard regiments. But the specifications were nearly identical. A bolt round doesn't care about the ideology of the person firing it. The machine doesn't change its nature based on the prayers spoken over it. A firing mechanism that works under the loyalist Mechanicus works the same under the dark Mechanicus. Function is function. Production is production. The machine doesn't care. 3 months after the conquest, I was selected for additional servitor maintenance training. This had happened twice before under the old Magi. Workers who showed aptitude with machine interfaces were given expanded duties to increase their value to the Forge. I reported to Training Bay Epsilon 7, expecting some new horror, some chaos-corrupted nightmare that would finally confirm that things had actually changed. The servitor maintenance bay looked exactly like it had during my previous training sessions. Rows of servitors in various states of repair, their cybernetic components exposed, their organic elements kept alive by tubes pumping nutrient solutions and waste removal. The only difference was the instructor, a dark Mechanicus adept, whose lower face had been replaced with what looked like a nest of writhing tubes that connected directly to his respiratory system. Servitor Unit 773 requires neural interface calibration. He buzzed through his tubes. Standard procedure. Demonstrate your proficiency. I approached the servitor, a former manufactorum worker like myself, though whatever he had been before his conversion was long erased by the crude lobotomy scars and the heavy industrial augmetics that had replaced most of his torso. His eyes were open but empty. No consciousness remained, just enough brain function to follow simple commands and operate his integrated tools. I performed the neural calibration exactly as I had been taught 11 years ago during my initial training. Plug diagnostic cables into the skull ports, run the interface test, adjust the synaptic impedance until the response time fell within acceptable parameters, verify motor control, update the maintenance log. The adept watched through optical sensors that whirred and clicked. Adequate. You show proper reverence for the machine without unnecessary sentiment for the organic components. This is the correct approach. The flesh is weak. The machine endures. The organic elements are merely substrate for function. Yes, my lord. I had heard nearly identical words from Magos Deltrian. The phrasing was slightly different. He would have said, "The flesh is flawed," rather than weak. But the philosophy was the same. People were components. Consciousness was inefficient. The only value in a human was how well they could interface with machines or be converted into machine elements. "You may be suitable for deeper integration," the adept said, making notes on a data slate with mechadendrites that sprouted from his shoulders. "Your efficiency metrics and compliance ratings are above the threshold for augmentation candidacy. This is desirable. The dark Mechanicus rewards function over all else." Fear shot through my chest like ice water. Augmentation was supposed to be an honor under the old Mechanicus, a reward for loyal service, a chance to become more than merely human. But everyone knew that most augmentations were just a slower path to becoming a servitor. You'd get a new arm, then a new lung, then neural interfaces, then before you knew it, there wasn't enough of you left to resist when they decided to remove whatever consciousness remained and repurpose your body as a walking tool. I serve adequately in my current capacity, my lord. The tubes on his face writhed in what might have been amusement. Fare is inefficient but understandable. Augmentation under our doctrine is not punishment, it is enhancement. The old Mechanicus lied. They augmented as reward and as control, destroying the self while claiming to elevate it. We are more honest. Augmentation is function. If you are more useful with your current neural architecture intact, you will remain intact. If augmentation increases productivity, you will be augmented. Simple calculation. Merit determines form. He dismissed me back to my station. I walked through corridors that hummed with the same machinery, past workers who looked the same as they always had, to a workstation that was unchanged, but his words circled in my mind like a corrupted data loop. The old Mechanicus lied. Had they? Or was this just a different lie? Or were both telling the same truth from different angles, that people were just components, and the only difference was how honest your masters were about it? I assembled firing mechanisms until my shift ended. My productivity had increased to 0.41% above optimal. I received a notation of acceptable function in my work log. The same notation I used to receive under Magos Deltrian. Nothing had changed. Should workers have been told the truth about what their service really meant? If you think honesty would have made any difference, press like. But ask yourself if you truly believe that. The first execution happened in month 4. A worker named Gavin Thross, Manufactorum Grade 5, Power Cell Assembly. I didn't know him well. Different section, different shift, but I had seen him at the protein dispensers occasionally. Young. Maybe 20 standard years. He had arrived at the forge only 2 years before the dark Mechanicus conquest, so he barely remembered life before Manufactorum service. They assembled us in Processing Bay Delta for the execution. All workers from Theta 99 and adjacent sections. Approximately 4,000 people crammed into a space designed for equipment processing. The heat was unbearable. Bodies packed so tight I could feel the worker in front of me breathing, could smell the machine oil and sweat and recycled air that we all carried like a second skin. Gavin was suspended by chains from an overhead crane. His arms spread, his work clothes stripped away to reveal a body already showing the early signs of manufactorum degradation. Chemical burns, radiation scarring, the particular skeletal thinness that came from years of minimal nutrition and maximum physical stress. A dark Mechanicus priest I had never seen before stood on a raised platform, his voice amplified through vox speakers that made the enclosed space ring with metallic feedback. This worker committed sabotage. He intentionally assembled power cells with reversed polarity, causing catastrophic failure in 17 units before detection. This cost the forge 12 hours of production and wasted blessed components. Under the old Mechanicus, his punishment would be servitor conversion. We are more efficient. Waste will be eliminated, not repurposed into further inefficiency. The execution was carried out with an industrial plasma cutter. Quick, brutal, efficient. Gavin didn't even have time to scream. The plasma lance severed him vertically in less than 3 seconds, his body falling in 2 pieces that hit the floor with wet sounds that echoed through the sudden silence. Return to your stations. Quotas remain unchanged. Lost time will be compensated through extended shifts. We filed out in silence. I tried not to look at the blood that was already being cleaned by servitors, equipped with industrial degreasing equipment. The same servitors that cleaned any spill. Coolant, oil, human remains, all equally fluid waste to be removed so work could continue. Back at my station, my hands shook as I picked up the first firing mechanism of the shift. I kept thinking about what the priest had said. Under the old Mechanicus, Gavin would have been converted into a servitor. They would have lobotomized him, augmented him with industrial equipment, erased whatever he was, and turned him into a walking tool. Then they would have worked him until his organic components failed completely, at which point they would have harvested any useful augmetics and processed the rest into corpse starch. The dark Mechanicus had just killed him and moved on. I didn't know which was worse. I didn't know if there was a difference. The worker at the adjacent station, Mikhail, I had known him for 7 years. He assembled trigger mechanisms, leaned slightly toward me without looking up from his work. His voice was barely a whisper under the machinery hum. Gavin didn't sabotage anything. The power cells failed because they pushed us to 12-hour cycles without maintenance breaks. Equipment malfunctions. But they needed someone to blame for the production loss. "How do you know?" I whispered back, keeping my hands moving, assembling mechanisms on pure muscle memory while my mind reeled. Same thing happened under the old Magi. Production loss needed explanation. Worker error is always acceptable. Explanation. Gavin was just unlucky. His section, his shift, his name pulled from the roster. I wanted to argue, wanted to believe that there had been actual sabotage, that Gavin had been a secret loyalist trying to resist, that his death had meant something beyond random selection for blame. But I couldn't convince myself. I had seen the same pattern under the old Mechanicus. Production quotas missed. Investigation launched. Worker blamed. Servitor conversion authorized. Quotas adjusted to account for lost labor. Repeat forever. The only difference was the method of disposal. I worked my shift. Extended shift, we added 4 hours to compensate for the time spent at the execution and the production loss from Gavin's section. My productivity fell to 0.17% below optimal from exhaustion. I received a notation of inadequate function in my work log. The first such notation in 14 months. That night in my HAB unit, I lay on my sleeping mat and stared at the ceiling, which was so close I could touch it without fully extending my arm. Around me, 7 other workers breathed in the darkness, too exhausted to talk, too conditioned to dream of anything but workstations and assembly quotas. I thought about my mother, who I hadn't seen in 11 years. Wondered if she was even alive. Wondered if she knew the forge had been conquered. Wondered if it would have mattered to her that her son now served chaos instead of the Emperor. Wondered if she had ever understood that there was no meaningful difference, that I had always been a component in a machine that didn't care about loyalty, ideology, or human life. Only function. Only production. Only the eternal quota that could never be met, because every quota fulfilled just led to a higher quota demanded. The machine god doesn't care. The dark Mechanicus priest had said, only function matters. But the old Magi had taught the same thing, just in different words. The Omnissiah's will requires your service. The Emperor needs your production. The Imperium depends on your labor. Different justifications for the same reality. You are disposable. You are replaceable, and you will work until you break, and then you will be replaced by someone exactly like you, and the machine will continue, eternal and uncaring. Nothing had changed. Chaos had conquered my world, and nothing had changed. I didn't know whether to laugh or weep. I was too tired to do either. I closed my eyes and slept the shallow, dreamless sleep of the exhausted. And when the cycle start alarm screamed through the HAB unit 6 hours later, I rose and reported to Station 7-4 Alpha and began assembling firing mechanisms exactly as I had done yesterday, and exactly as I would do tomorrow and forever. This cycle has repeated for 10,000 years across 1,000,000 worlds. If you believe someone needs to remember that it's all the same, subscribe so this truth doesn't remain forgotten. Year 1 after the conquest, I learned the new prayers. They weren't dramatically different from the old prayers, where we used to say, by the Emperor's grace, let this mechanism function. We now said, by function's imperative, let this mechanism serve. The cadence was the same. The rhythm was the same. The act of whispering prayers while assembling blessed components was the same. The machine god had simply shed one of his titles and taken another. Or perhaps it was the same machine god, and we had simply been mistaken about which aspects of his nature we were worshipping. The old Magi said the Omnissiah was holy because he was loyal to the Emperor. The dark Mechanicus said the machine was holy because it existed beyond loyalty, beyond ideology, as pure function and eternal mechanism. Different theology, same machines, same work. Same workers growing old assembling the same components. I was approaching 31 standard years. My lungs carried a permanent rattle from breathing superheated air mixed with metal particulates. My hands had developed tremors that I had to consciously suppress during fine assembly work. My spine curved slightly from years of bending over workstations. I looked at my reflection in polished metal surfaces and saw someone who was already becoming a corpse. Just one that still walked and worked and served whatever master claimed ownership of the forge. New workers arrived. They were young, 13, 14 standard years. Pulled from the lower hive levels just like I had been, tested for manual dexterity and obedience. selected for manufactorum service because they scored adequately, and because the forge needed to replace workers who had died or been converted to servitors or simply broken down from accumulated years of service. I was assigned to train a new worker named Petron. He was 14, thin like they all were when they arrived, eyes that still carried something like hope. He believed he had been chosen for honor. He believed serving the forge meant something. He believed the dark Mechanicus when they told him his work served the machine god. I taught him how to assemble bolt pistol firing mechanisms, showed him the proper way to apply blessed oils, corrected his prayer cadences when he fumbled the words, demonstrated the technique for testing spring tensions without damaging the blessed components. He was eager, asked questions, wanted to understand the mechanisms he was assembling, wanted to know what they would be used for, wanted to believe his work had meaning beyond the simple fact of production. "These will be used by the Black Legion?" he asked on his third day, holding a completed firing mechanism up to examine it in the sodium lamp light. Yes. I didn't tell him that last year the identical mechanisms went to the Ultramarines. Didn't tell him that the mechanisms didn't care who used them. Didn't tell him that he was assembling tools for killing people who served the Emperor, just as he had been told he was serving the Emperor when the selection priests came through the hive levels. We're fighting the Imperium then. We're chaos now. We're workers. We assemble what we're told to assemble. The forge produces. We are part of the forge. He looked at me with confusion in his young eyes. "But don't you care about who wins, about which side we're on?" I wanted to laugh, wanted to weep, wanted to grab him by his thin shoulders and explain that there were no sides, not for people like us. There were only the ones who gave orders and the ones who followed them, and we had always been and would always be in the second category, regardless of what flags the order givers flew or what prayers they demanded we speak. But I was too tired for that conversation. Too worn down, too close to becoming the same empty shell that I had learned to build my life around. "Care about your efficiency metrics," I said instead. "Care about meeting your quotas. Care about proper blessed oil application and correct prayer cadence. Care about the things you can control. Everything else is someone else's concern." He didn't understand. I saw the incomprehension in his face, the way he wanted to argue but didn't know how to articulate what he was feeling. He would learn eventually. They all did. You learned or you broke, and if you broke, you became a servitor or corpse starch. So learning was the only real option. I watched him over the following weeks as the hope gradually drained from his eyes, as he stopped asking questions about meaning and started asking questions about technique. As his prayer cadences became automatic, words spoken without thought, just sounds to accompany the mechanical actions of assembly. As he learned to ignore the pain in his hands from repetitive motion, the burning in his lungs from chemical-laden air, the ache in his spine from hours bent over the workstation. He was becoming what I had become, what every worker eventually became. A component, a function, a thing that existed to serve the forge's production quotas until it stopped functioning adequately and was replaced. 6 months into training him, the forge received a new shipment of blessed components from one of the orbital factories. Something in the quality control had failed. The springs were improperly tempered, causing them to break under normal operating stress. We discovered this when the first batch of firing mechanisms we assembled failed testing. Then the second batch, then the third. Under the old Mechanicus, this would have been a crisis. Margos Deltrian would have launched an investigation into tech heresy, would have blessed the factory's machine spirits, would have punished the workers involved in the improper tempering, would have ordered us to rework all the faulty components by hand to bring them to acceptable specifications. The Dark Mechanicus took a different approach. Components are faulty. Reworking is inefficient. Assemble mechanisms with faulty components, adjust tolerances to accept increased failure rate. Increase production quantity by 15% to compensate for projected field failures. Update quotas accordingly. Petran looked at me with horror on his young face. We're going to assemble mechanisms that we know will fail. That could get someone killed? Someone will get killed regardless. The mechanisms work adequately. They just fail more often than optimal specifications. We'll make more to compensate. Production continues. But that's... He struggled for the word. That's murder, giving someone a weapon you know will fail in combat. I set down the firing mechanism I was assembling, looked at him directly, decided he had earned some honesty. Under the old Mechanicus, I once spent a month reworking faulty components by hand. 16-hour shifts, no rest days, working with tools that cut my fingers to bone because we couldn't take time to wrap the handles properly. 3 workers from my section died. 1 from exhaustion, 2 from infection in their wounds. When we finished, we had successfully reworked 93% of the components to acceptable specifications. The remaining 7% were destroyed. 3 human lives to save 7% of components that were going to be used to kill other humans in battles we would never hear about for reasons we would never understand. Petran was silent. Different masters, I continued. Same calculations. Everything is acceptable losses. The only difference is what they decide to optimize for. The old Mechanicus optimized for component quality and spent human lives to achieve it. The Dark Mechanicus optimizes for production speed and accepts reduced component quality. Either way, we work until we break, and the machine continues. The only question is which broken things we're producing, broken workers or broken weapons. There has to be a difference, he said quietly. There has to be meaning in what we do. There is meaning. The forge produces. We are part of the forge. We function adequately or we are replaced. That's the only meaning that matters. He turned back to his workstation without another word. But I saw something die in his eyes that day. Some last piece of the boy who had arrived 6 months ago, believing he had been chosen for something important. I had killed that piece of him, just as my trainer had killed it in me, just as it was killed in every worker who survived long enough to understand the truth. You couldn't carry hope and survive in the forge. Hope was weight you couldn't afford. Hope made you care about things beyond your control. Hope made you vulnerable to the despair that came when you realized nothing you did mattered beyond the simple mechanical function of production. Better to become empty. Better to become automatic. Better to become like the machines you served. Responding to inputs with predictable outputs, existing without caring, functioning without meaning. That night, lying in my HAB unit, listening to workers breathe in the darkness, I thought about Petran's question. Did I care which side won? Imperium or chaos? Loyalist or traitor? Did it matter to me who ultimately controlled the forge? The honest answer was no. I didn't care. Couldn't afford to care. Caring changed nothing about my life. I would work regardless. I would assemble components for whoever commanded the forge. I would speak whatever prayers they demanded. I would serve whatever ideology they claimed justified their authority. Because the alternative was death or servitor conversion, and I wasn't ready for either yet. And maybe I never would be, because humans were adaptable creatures who could survive almost anything if survival meant simply continuing to exist. And I had learned that survival was the only goal that mattered in a universe where larger purposes were just lies told by the powerful to control the weak. Chaos had conquered my world, and nothing had changed because nothing could change. The system was the same regardless of who operated it. Workers worked. Machines produced. Masters controlled. The only thing that varied was the prayers we spoke while it happened, and prayers were just noise, just sounds to fill the silence, just words to convince ourselves that our suffering had meaning, when the truth was that meaning was a luxury for people who weren't too exhausted to care. I closed my eyes and slept and dreamed of nothing, and when the cycle start alarm sounded, I rose and reported to my station and began assembling firing mechanisms that I knew would fail and kill people I would never meet, and I felt nothing about it at all, and that absence of feeling was its own kind of damnation. And I understood finally that chaos hadn't corrupted me with mutation or madness, but with something far simpler: indifference. Comment where you're watching from. Let them know someone, somewhere, still asks if there was ever a choice. Year 3. The Dark Mechanicus announced an innovation initiative. Workers who could suggest improvements to production efficiency would receive extended nutrient rations and reduced shift hours. This was unprecedented. Under the old Mechanicus, suggesting changes to established procedures was tech heresy. The rights had been handed down for generations, blessed by the Omnissiah, proven through centuries of function. To suggest alteration was to doubt the machine god's perfection. But the Dark Mechanicus didn't worship perfection. They worshipped function, and function could always be optimized. I submitted a suggestion. The bolt pistol firing mechanisms could be assembled 16% faster if we rearrange the workstation to cluster related tools within closer reach, reducing arm movement during component selection. It was a minor change. Obvious, really. I'd been thinking about it for years, but never dared suggest it because Magos Deltrian would have considered it heretical pride to question the workstation layouts that had been established by tech priests generations ago. My suggestion was implemented within a week. My efficiency metrics jumped to 0.89% above optimal. I received an additional 30 minutes of nutrient ration allocation per day, and my shift were reduced by 1 hour. Petron looked at me with something like betrayal when the announcements were posted. You're helping them. You're making their production more efficient. You're helping chaos. I'm making my own life easier. Extra food, shorter shifts. That's all this is. You could have suggested inefficiencies. You could have sabotaged them. I laughed, actually laughed, though it sounded more like coughing. And ended up like Gavin, cut in half with a plasma lance for sabotage. I'm 33 years old. My lungs are failing. My hands shake. My spine is degenerating. I have maybe 10 more years before I break completely. I'm going to spend those years a little less hungry and a little less exhausted if I can. But the principles are for people who can afford them. I can't. Neither can you. We're workers. We have nothing except the capacity to work, and we'll work for whoever feeds us and doesn't kill us. And if one master offers slightly better conditions for slightly more efficient service, then we take that offer because it's the only choice we actually have. More workers submitted suggestions. The Dark Mechanicus implemented dozens of efficiency improvements over the following months. Production increased by 23%. They expanded the initiative. Workers could now suggest equipment modifications, protocol adjustments, even prayer cadence optimizations. Anything that increased function was acceptable. The irony was suffocating. Under the loyalist Mechanicus, we had maintained traditions that were demonstrably inefficient because tradition itself was sacred. Under the Dark Mechanicus, we were innovating, optimizing, improving, all in service of producing more weapons for Chaos forces to use against the Imperium. Some workers saw this as corruption. They whispered in the HAB units about how we were being seduced, how Chaos was making us complicit through small comforts, how accepting better conditions made us traitors. A few tried to resist, subtle sabotage, slowdowns, organizing quiet protests by collectively reducing efficiency. The Dark Mechanicus identified them through productivity metrics and executed them. Not dramatically. No public displays like with Gavin. Just quiet disappearances. Workers who went to their shifts and never came back. Names removed from rosters. HAB unit assignments redistributing to account for reduced numbers. The Forge adjusted and continued. Most workers didn't resist. Most workers submitted suggestions. Most workers took the extra food and shorter shifts and better working conditions and told themselves it didn't make them traitors because they had never been given a choice about which masters they served, so they couldn't be blamed for making their servitude slightly more bearable. I was one of them. I submitted 7 suggestions over year 3. All were implemented. My efficiency metrics stayed consistently above optimal. My nutrient rations increased by 40%. My shifts reduced by 90 minutes. I was healthier than I had been in years. My tremors decreased. My lung function stabilized. I actually felt better, and that was the worst part. I felt better serving Chaos than I had serving the Emperor. Not because Chaos was better. Chaos was just as exploitative, just as willing to kill workers for insufficient productivity, just as uncaring about our humanity. But Chaos was more efficient in its exploitation. It understood that slightly better conditions produced significantly better results. It wasn't mercy. It was just better resource management. The old Mechanicus had run workers into the ground through tradition and dogma, replacing them when they broke because there were always more bodies in the hive levels. The Dark Mechanicus optimized worker longevity because recruiting and training new workers cost time and resources. Both systems treated us as disposable. One disposed of us quickly. One disposed of us slowly. The difference was real for us. We lived longer, suffered less, worked under better conditions. But the principle remained identical. We existed to serve, and when we ceased being useful, we would be discarded. Petron never submitted suggestions. His efficiency metrics stayed barely above acceptable minimums. He received no extra rations, no reduced shifts. He grew thinner while I grew healthier. His hands developed the tremors mine were losing. His lung rattle worsened while mine improved. One day I found him sitting in the HAB unit during what should have been his sleep period, staring at the wall, tears running down his face. "I can't do this anymore," he said. "I can't keep serving them. I can't keep being complicit." "Then you'll die. Or worse, servitor conversion. They don't do it often, but they do it. I've seen 3 workers converted this year for persistent, inadequate function. Maybe that would be better. At least I wouldn't know what I'd become." I sat down next to him, felt the weight of my improved health against his deterioration, understood that I was everything he feared becoming. Someone who had accepted the system so completely that I was now optimizing my own exploitation. "Listen to me," I said quietly. "You think resistance means something. You think suffering under bad conditions proves your loyalty to the Emperor. You think if you just hold on to your principles hard enough, it will matter. But it won't. The Emperor isn't coming to save you. The Imperium isn't going to liberate this forge. You're going to work here until you break. And your choice is whether you break quickly in misery or slowly with slightly less misery. That's the only choice you actually have. How can you live with yourself? You're helping them win. They already won. They won the moment they breached the Forge's defenses 3 years ago. Everything since then has just been us pretending we still had agency. We don't. We never did. The only difference between now and before is that they're slightly more honest about it." He looked at me with such disgust that I almost felt something. Almost felt shame. Almost felt like I should be ashamed. But I was too tired for shame. Too worn down. Too committed to survival to care about his judgment. A week later, Petron submitted his first suggestion. It was a good one. A modification to the trigger mechanism assembly sequence that increased speed by 11%. They implemented it. His rations increased, his shifts reduced. He wouldn't look at me afterward. Couldn't stand to acknowledge what we both knew. He had broken. He had made the same calculation I had made. He had chosen survival over principles. He had learned what every worker eventually learned, that principles were luxuries you couldn't afford when your only alternative was death. The machine had claimed another one. Not through mutation or madness or dramatic corruption, just through the slow, grinding process of making survival contingent on cooperation, of making life slightly less unbearable in exchange for slightly better service, of offering small mercies that cost nothing but bought everything. This was how chaos won. Not through tentacles and mutations, through efficiency metrics and nutrient rations, through the simple recognition that humans would serve any master who made their suffering slightly more bearable, and that loyalty could be purchased cheaply when the alternative was grinding poverty and early death. If you think the price was too high, show it, like and subscribe. But ask yourself what price you would have paid. Year 5. I stopped counting the details. Time had become less distinct, not because of any chaos corruption or warp influence, just because when every day is identical to the one before, they blend together into a continuous present that has no clear boundaries. Work, sleep, work, sleep. The same stations and the same components and the same prayers. Slightly different words, but the same rhythm, the same purpose, the same endless production. I was 35 standard years old. I looked 50. The forge consumed people at accelerated rates. The chemicals, the radiation, the stress, the minimal nutrition despite the improved rations. Most workers didn't survive to 40. I was already past the average age in my section. I'd become one of the senior workers, training newcomers, supervising assembly lines, managing quality control. I had authority. Limited, carefully circumscribed authority that only existed within the context of production efficiency, but authority nonetheless. When I spoke, younger workers listened. When I made suggestions, supervisors implemented them. When I filed reports about inadequate function, workers were punished or disappeared. I had become the system, not just a component within it, but an active agent of its perpetuation. I was the one who taught new workers how to survive by accepting. I was the one who identified resistors before they could spread dissent. I was the one who optimized our exploitation and called it improvement. The worst part was that I didn't feel corrupted. I didn't feel like I had fallen to chaos. I felt practical, realistic, honest about what our lives were and what they would always be regardless of who gave the orders. The old workers who clung to memories of Imperial loyalty seemed naive to me now. They were living in fantasies, pretending that there had been meaning in their suffering under the old Mechanicus, pretending that their current suffering represented a fall rather than just a continuation. We had always been this. Chaos had just removed the comforting lies. Mid-year 5, the Forge's Vox networks crackled with unexpected announcements. A loyalist Mechanicus fleet had entered the system. They were coming to liberate us, to reclaim the Forge for the Omnissiah, to purge the chaos taint. I felt nothing hearing this. Not hope, not fear. Just a kind of tired resignation. Liberation meant destruction, meant rebuilding, meant new masters with the same demands. The Forge would be contested. Workers would die in the crossfire. Production would be disrupted. Quotas would shift to support the military effort. Eventually, one side would win and workers would return to their stations and production would continue and nothing fundamental would change. The Dark Mechanicus gathered us for briefings. The tone was matter-of-fact. Loyalist forces are approaching. The Forge will be defended. Your production quotas are temporarily adjusted to support military manufacturing. Extended shifts will be necessary. Additional nutrient rations will be provided to maintain function. Continue working. The machine endures regardless of temporary conflicts. No speeches about glory, no promises of reward, no threats about punishment. Just simple statements of what would happen and what was expected. It was almost refreshing in its honesty. The bombardment started 3 weeks later. I could hear it even through the Forge's heavy shielding, distant thunder that made the walls vibrate, that sent dust filtering down from ceiling joints, that reminded us there was a universe beyond the manufactorum, where people fought and died over questions of ideology that meant nothing to us. Production continued. We assembled components while the Forge shook around us. We ran quality control tests while explosions echoed through the superstructure. We maintained our efficiency metrics while battles raged in the void overhead and in the outer foundry levels. Petran was at the adjacent station. He was 20 now, had been serving for 6 years, looked 35. We had long since stopped arguing. We had achieved a kind of understanding. We were both complicit, both trapped, both surviving the only way we knew how. Sometimes in the few minutes between shifts, we would stand together at the observation port that looked out over the main assembly floor, watching thousands of workers move in synchronized patterns like organic components in some vast machine. and neither of us would say anything because there was nothing left to say that we hadn't already said or already understood. "Think they'll win?" he asked one day as another bombardment shook the walls. "Someone will win, doesn't matter who." "It should matter. I know, but it doesn't. Not to us." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I don't remember what it felt like. To care, to believe things mattered beyond just surviving them. I'm 20 years old, and I don't remember what hope felt like. Is that corruption? Is that what chaos did to us?" I thought about his question carefully, gave it the consideration it deserved. "No, that's what the Forge did to us. Chaos, Imperium, doesn't matter. The Forge eats hope. It has to. Hope makes workers inefficient. Hope makes them question. Hope makes them imagine alternatives. The Forge can't allow alternatives. So it grinds hope out of everyone who serves long enough to understand what their service actually means. The only difference is that the old Mechanicus pretended the grinding served a holy purpose. The dark Mechanicus admits it's just mechanical necessity. So we're not corrupted. We're just broken. We're functional. That's the only metric that matters. The bombardment intensified over the following weeks. Power fluctuations became frequent. Whole sections of the Forge went dark as energy was diverted to defensive weapons and void shields. Workers died when a direct hit breached Section Gamma 4 and vented 3 entire levels to space. We received updated rosters, adjusted our workflows to account for lost personnel, continued production. I wondered sometimes whether the workers who died in that breach were better off. Quick death. No consciousness of the end. Just sudden decompression. And then nothing. Cleaner than what awaited the rest of us. Years of grinding service until our bodies failed. Until we became servitors or corpse starch. Until we were replaced by the next generation who would serve the next masters under the next ideology. But I didn't actually want to die. That was the sick part. I wanted to survive, wanted my 30 minutes of extra rations and my reduced shifts and my authority over other workers. Wanted to continue existing even though I couldn't articulate why existence mattered when existence was just this. Endless work in service of production goals that served purposes I would never understand, for the benefit of people who saw me as nothing more than a biological component in their machines. The battle for the Forge lasted 83 days. I counted them because the production schedules marked them, because quotas were adjusted daily based on military necessity, because time regained meaning when it was measured in crisis rather than routine. Then, one day, the bombardment stopped. The Vox networks went silent for 6 hours. When they came back online, the voice speaking through them had changed. It was a loyalist Mechanicus Magos. I could tell by the particular modulation of his Vox grill, by the high Gothic prayer phrases he used, by the way he spoke about the Omnissiah's will as absolute rather than functional. Workers of Forge World Chthonius Secundus, you have been liberated. The Chaos taint has been purged. The Machine God's glory has been restored. You are saved. I stood at my workstation, hands frozen on the firing mechanism I had been assembling. Bolt pistol component, same specifications as always, blessed oils applied correctly, prayers whispered properly. The only thing that had changed was which masters claimed authority to define properly. All personnel will be subject to purity testing, the Magos continued. Those who maintained faith will be absolved. Those who collaborated with the traitors will be cleansed. The Omnissiah protects. Petran looked at me across the workstation. His eyes held something I hadn't seen in years. Fear. Real, immediate fear. Not the dull anxiety of daily survival, but sharp terror. "We collaborated," he whispered. "We submitted suggestions. We helped them optimize production. They have records. They'll know." Everyone collaborated. Everyone survived. That's what survival means under occupation. You think they'll care about that? You think they'll understand? I wanted to reassure him. Wanted to believe that the loyalist Mechanicus would recognize that workers had no choice, that resistance wasn't possible, that collaboration was just survival. But I remembered the way Magos Deltrian used to punish the smallest deviations from protocol. Remembered the tech heresy investigations. Remembered how the old Mechanicus was more concerned with purity than pragmatism. "No," I said honestly. "They won't understand. They won't care. We survived chaos occupation. That makes us suspect. They'll purge first and investigate later." The purity testing began the next day. Workers were pulled from stations in groups of 50, marched to Processing Bay Delta, the same bay where Gavin had been executed 6 years ago, and subjected to interrogations by loyalist tech priests. I was in the third group, stood in line with 49 other workers, all of us silent, all of us knowing that we were being evaluated for execution, but unable to articulate what crime we had committed beyond the crime of surviving. The interrogation was conducted by a tech priest, whose face was a bronze mask without features, only optical sensors that glowed red in the dim lighting. He accessed my work records through a data slate covered in purity seals. Heydrich Venn, Manufactorum, Grade 7, promoted to Section Supervisor during Chaos Occupation. You submitted 11 suggestions for production optimization that were implemented by the traitor Mechanicus. You received extended rations and reduced shifts as reward for collaboration. You trained 23 workers in protocols approved by heretics. Explain your actions. I did what was necessary to survive, my lord. I had no choice. Everyone has a choice. You chose to serve the enemy efficiently rather than resist or die. This choice defines you as collaborator. Collaboration with chaos is heresy. Heresy demands cleansing. The protocols I suggested weren't heretical. They were efficiency improvements, the same improvements I would have suggested to loyalist Mechanicus if they had allowed suggestions. The work was the same. The components were the same. Only the masters changed. The bronze mask tilted slightly. You claim no difference exists between serving the Omnissiah and serving the ruinous powers. I claim that from a workstation they look identical. I assembled firing mechanisms. I applied blessed oils. I spoke prayers. The same actions every day for 16 years, regardless of which ideology justified them. This is precisely the corruption we must purge. You have lost the capacity to distinguish sacred service from profane exploitation. You see only mechanical function where you should perceive holy purpose. Your soul is compromised, even if your flesh shows no mutation. He made a notation on the data slate. I knew what it meant. I had seen enough executions, known enough disappeared workers, understood how the Imperium dealt with ambiguity. When in doubt, purge. Better to kill 1,000 innocents than risk one heretic surviving. You will be cleansed, the tech priest said. The Emperor protects. They marched me to a holding pen with approximately 300 other workers, who had been designated for cleansing. We stood in silence, packed together in a space too small for our numbers, breathing recycled air that smelled like fear and resignation. Petron was there. He found me in the crowd, pushed through the packed bodies until we stood face to face. "I submitted 3 suggestions," he said. His voice was hollow. 3 suggestions in 2 years. I thought I was being loyal by only doing the minimum. I thought I was resisting, but they're going to kill me for it anyway. Yes. Was there any path we could have taken, anything we could have done differently? I thought about his question, thought about 16 years of service, thought about all the choices that hadn't been choices, all the alternatives that had never existed, all the moments when I had believed I was making decisions but was really just responding to the limited options presented by people who had all the power while I had none. "No," I said. "We were always going to end here. The only question was whether we ended here quickly or slowly. You chose slowly. I chose slowly. Some workers chose quickly, the resistors who were executed for sabotage. But we all ended up in the same place eventually. The machine doesn't care about our choices. It only cares that we served until we were used up. The Imperium," he said. "Chaos. They're the same. Yes. We never had a chance." "No," he laughed, actually laughed, though it sounded like sobbing. "The joke is that I still believe. I still pray to the Emperor. I still think the Omnissiah is real. I just know now that neither of them care about people like us. We're beneath their notice, too small to matter, just numbers in a production log. But I still believe. Even knowing they've abandoned us, even knowing they never knew we existed, I still pray." I didn't pray anymore. Hadn't for years. The prayers had become automatic, just sounds to accompany work. No meaning behind them. But I understood what Petron meant. The need to believe in something beyond the grinding mechanism of service and suffering. The need to imagine that our pain served some purpose, even when all evidence suggested it served nothing but the perpetuation of systems that would continue long after we were forgotten. The executions happened at dawn the next day. Mass cleansing with industrial plasma cutters, efficient and quick. 300 workers reduced to ash and bone fragments that would be processed into corpse starch and fed back to the remaining workers as protein rations. I stood in line and watched the people ahead of me die, and felt nothing except tired recognition. This was how it always ended for people like us. We served until we were used up, and then we were disposed of, and whether our service had been to loyalists or traitors made no difference to our final destination. The machine consumed everything. The only variable was how long you lasted before it finished consuming you. When my turn came, I looked at the tech priest operating the plasma cutter. Saw in his posture the same mechanical efficiency that the dark Mechanicus had shown. Saw in his actions the same disregard for individual humanity that Chaos had demonstrated. Saw in his righteousness the same indifference that characterized every master I had ever served. "Any final confession?" he asked. Standard protocol. They always asked. "Yes," I said. "You're no different than them, loyalist, traitor, chaos, Imperium. You're all the same machine wearing different masks. You'll kill me for surviving under Chaos occupation the same way Chaos killed others for resisting. You'll justify it with different theology. But the action is identical. The indifference is identical. The machine is identical." "Heresy," he said without emotion. This confirms the purity of your cleansing. The plasma cutter activated. I had time for one final thought before the heat vaporized consciousness along with flesh. Nothing had changed. Chaos had conquered my world, and nothing had changed. The Imperium had reclaimed my world, and nothing had changed. The machine continued. The quotas continued. The suffering continued. Only the workers changed, each generation consumed and replaced by the next, all of us serving the same eternal mechanism that called itself holy, and called itself necessary, and called itself inevitable. And maybe it was all three, or maybe those were just lies. The machine told itself to justify its hunger, and I would never know because I was dying now, burning now, becoming ash now, and my last sensation was heat, and my last emotion was nothing at all. And that nothingness was its own answer to every question I had ever asked about meaning and purpose, and whether anything I had done in 16 years of service had mattered in any way beyond the simple mechanical fact that I had existed and worked, and now was ceasing to do both. And the forge would continue without me, and new workers would stand at my station, and they would assemble the same components and speak the same prayers and serve the same masters under different names, and the cycle would perpetuate forever, or until the heat death of the universe, whichever came first. And I envied the heat death because at least that would be final, while we were trapped in eternal repetition, serving machines that called themselves gods and demanding we believe that our suffering was holy, when the truth was simpler and more terrible than any heresy. Our suffering meant nothing, served nothing, changed nothing, was simply the background condition of existence for people born without power in a universe that had been designed by the powerful to extract maximum utility from our bodies before discarding them like the worn components we had spent our lives assembling. And this was the real horror. Not mutation or madness or chaos corruption, but the simple recognition that we had always been disposable and always would be. And nothing, not loyalty, not resistance, not faith, not despair, nothing we could do would ever change that fundamental truth, and we died knowing it. And that knowledge was the only thing we ever truly owned. And now even that was being taken away as the plasma reduced thought to carbon and carbon to ash and ash to nothing. Now you understand what the Imperium truly costs. If you dare learn more about the truths they never speak aloud, subscribe. The Emperor protects. But from what I've shown you, there is no protection, only endless service, only eternal consumption. Only the machine. The machine continues. It always has. It always will. Somewhere on Forge World Thonis Secundus, a new worker stands at Station 74 Alpha, assembling bolt pistol-firing mechanisms, whispering prayers that mean nothing, serving masters who don't know his name. He is 14 years old. He believes his service matters. He believes he was chosen for honor. He will learn. They all learn. The Forge teaches the same lesson to every generation. You are components, nothing more, and components are replaced when they break, and you will break, and the machine will continue, and this is forever. This has always been forever. This will always be forever. The Emperor protects, but not you. Never you. You are never meant to be protected. Only used. Only consumed. Only fed into the eternal mechanism that grinds everything human into production quotas and efficiency metrics, and the cold mathematics of exploitation that spans galaxies and millennia, and calls itself necessary and calls itself holy, and is neither, but cannot be stopped, because it is vast beyond comprehension, and old beyond memory, and hungry beyond satisfaction, and we are so very small, and so very temporary, and so very forgotten. The machine. God doesn't care about your prayers. It only cares that you function. Function until you break. Then be replaced. This is the only truth. Everything else is theology designed to make the grinding more bearable. The Imperium and Chaos are just different theological frameworks for the same mechanical reality. You will serve. You will suffer. You will be consumed. The only question is which lies you tell yourself while it happens. Most workers choose comfortable lies. Petrin chose to believe the Emperor still cared, even knowing he didn't. I chose to believe survival was enough, even knowing it wasn't. Other workers chose other lies, that resistance mattered, that collaboration was justified, that someday something would change. All lies, but necessary lies, because the truth was too heavy to carry every day. The truth crushed you. The truth made continued existence impossible. So you wrapped yourself in lies like armor, and you survived behind them, and you tried not to think about what survival cost, or what it made you, or whether there was any difference between living and merely continuing to function. I don't know if there was a difference. I never figured it out. I died not knowing, and now there's no one left who remembers that I existed. And soon there will be no one who remembers anyone who remembered me. And eventually even the records will be purged or lost. And Hadric Ven will be completely erased from history, and it will be as if I never existed at all. And perhaps that's the final mercy, not just death, but the eventual erasure of any evidence that you ever suffered, ever served, ever stood at a workstation assembling components for 16 years, while your body broke down and your mind hollowed out, and your capacity for hope or despair or any strong emotion gradually died, until you were just going through motions you no longer remembered starting. The new workers don't remember us. The forge doesn't memorialize the consumed. There are no monuments to dead laborers. Just new laborers standing at the same stations, learning the same techniques, speaking the same prayers, making the same compromises, breaking down in the same ways. This is the cycle. This is forever. This is the Imperium, and this is chaos, and this is the truth that neither wants you to understand. They are the same. They have always been the same. They will always be the same, and you are caught between two versions of the same machine, and the machine is hungry, and the machine is eternal, and the machine is all there is, and this is what it means to serve, and this is what it costs. And this is why nothing changed when chaos conquered my world, because nothing could change, because the system is the system regardless of who operates it, and the system requires your suffering to function, and your suffering will continue until you break, and when you break you will be replaced, and the machine will continue, grinding through bodies and souls and lifetimes like grain through a mill, producing nothing of lasting value except more capacity to grind, more systems to consume, more workers to feed into the eternal mechanism of exploitation that we built and now cannot stop because it has grown larger than any individual or ideology or empire, larger than humanity itself, larger than the galaxy, a universal constant like gravity or time. The fundamental truth of existence. Everything eventually serves the machine, and the machine eventually consumes everything, and there is no escape, no alternative, no hope, only service, only consumption, only the eternal grinding of the mechanism that we call civilization and industry and progress, when what we mean is suffering organized efficiently enough to perpetuate itself forever. I am ash now. I am silence now. I am the forgotten worker whose name will never be remembered. I am every worker who ever served and died forgotten. I am the truth they don't want you to speak. I am the cost they pretend is acceptable. I am the sacrifice they call necessary. I am the suffering they call holy. I am what happens when the mask slips and you see the machine clearly. I am why nothing changed. I am why nothing can change. I am why you should be terrified. Not of chaos, not of mutation and madness and tentacles and corruption. Those are distractions. Those are the obvious horrors that let you ignore the real one. The real horror is this. The system doesn't need corruption to be monstrous. It was always monstrous. Chaos just stopped pretending otherwise. The real horror is this. You would have made the same choices I made. Everyone does. The forge breaks everyone eventually. There are no heroes at the workstation level, only survivors and corpses. The real horror is this. It's happening everywhere, on every forge world, in every manufactorum, across the entire Imperium, billions of people serving faithfully and suffering constantly and dying forgotten, and it's been happening for 10,000 years, and it will happen for 10,000 more. And this is what we mean when we say the Emperor protects. Not that he saves us, but that he protects the system that consumes us, that he sanctifies the grinding mechanism, that he makes our suffering holy, so we'll accept it as necessary. The real horror is that after everything I've told you, after all the suffering and grinding and consumption and death, the forge is still producing. Station 7-4 Alpha is still running. Someone is still assembling bolt pistol firing mechanisms. Someone is still breathing the chemical-laden air. Someone is still whispering the prayers. Someone is still learning that nothing matters beyond efficiency metrics and production quotas. Someone is still becoming what I became. Someone is still learning that nothing changes. The machine continues. The machine always continues. That is the only eternal truth in the grim darkness of the far future. There is no hope, only service, only consumption, only the grinding of the mechanism that calls itself holy and calls itself necessary, and is simply hungry, endlessly hungry, eternally hungry, consuming everything and giving back nothing except the continuation of its own hunger. This is what chaos showed us. This is what the Imperium hides. This is the truth. The machine doesn't care which gods you serve. It only cares that you serve, until you can't. Then you're gone, and it continues forever.